What does it take to make a veteran healthcare worker refuse to ever set foot in a certain hallway again? In today's video, we explore the unseen corners of the hospital network, the abandoned wings, the dead-end supply closets, the places where night shift staff are left alone with things that defy reason. You'll meet the hospital workers who encountered anomalies they couldn't explain and survived only to realize the nightmare followed them out. But before we get into the shadows, please subscribe and drop a like on the video. It means a great deal to this channel. Comment below to let me know what time it is where you are listening from. Now, turn down your lights, settle in, and let the quiet take over. My name is Arthur, and November is the only month I refuse to work the East Wing. Mercy General is built like a sprawling concrete octopus, with corridors branching out in the sections that were funded, built, and then promptly forgotten when budgets dried up. The East Wing was one of those casualties. It was undergoing an extensive renovation that stalled somewhere around late October. By November, it was a gutted shell of exposed drywall, hanging wires, and thick plastic sheeting draped over doorways to keep the construction dust from bleeding into the active intensive care units. Nobody went down there. The power was cut to bare minimum emergency lighting, casting sickly yellow pools on the unfinished floors. It was 2:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was nearing the end of a brutal double shift, fueled by stale coffee and sheer stubbornness. The daytime floor manager had left a note on the whiteboard that a spare crash card had been mistakenly rolled into the East Wing corridors by a new transfer orderly who got lost. My charge nurse asked me to go retrieve it. Stepping through the fire doors into the East Wing was like crossing into a dead zone. The ambient hum of the hospital, the beeping monitors, the murmur of voices, the rush of the VHS system vanished. The air grew stagnant. Dust coated the back of my throat. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating a long, straight hallway lined with those hanging plastic tarps. I walked for what felt like 10 minutes, my footsteps echoing far too loud against the bare concrete. I found the cart parked near the end of the main corridor, sitting crooked against a stack of drywall. I grabbed the handles, turned it around, and prepared for the long walk back. That was when the smell hit me. It was a sudden wave of metallic rot. It didn't waver or drift in on a breeze. It manifested right in front of my face. It smelled like a jar of old pennies that had been sitting in a puddle of spoiled milk and dirty rainwater for a decade. The odor was so aggressive it burned the lining of my nose. My eyes watered. I gagged, pulling my scrub collar up over my mouth. I guessed a pipe had burst. Maybe something rusted out in the walls. I pushed the cart forward, eager to get back to the clean, sterile air of the ICU. I took 5 steps. The beam of my flashlight swept across the hallway ahead. About 50 feet away, a gaunt silhouette stood in the center of the corridor. I stopped pushing the cart. My tired brain tried to process the shape. It was too tall, the proportions stretched and wrong. The arms hung down past its knees. It wore no clothes, just something dark and textured that seemed to absorb the weak yellow light. I figured my exhaustion was projecting shadows onto a discarded tarp. I rubbed my eyes. When I opened them, the shape was 40 feet away. It hadn't walked. It hadn't stepped. It just existed in a new location closer to me. The smell of metallic rot doubled in intensity, thickening the air until it felt like I was breathing underwater. My chest pounded so fiercely that my hands began to tremble. "Hey," I called out. My voice cracked. It sounded small and pathetic in the cavernous hallway. The figure did not respond. It did not shift. It stood rigid, facing me. My eyes began to sting from the dust and the foul air. I needed to blink. I held my eyes open, staring hard at the featureless face of the thing, trying to force it to make sense. The burning sensation in my corneas grew unbearable. I squeezed my eyes shut for a fraction of a second. When my eyelids parted, the silhouette was 30 feet away. Panic seized my chest. I couldn't breathe. Every time I broke eye contact, every time my vision was obscured for a millisecond, it covered 10 feet of ground in absolute dead silence. I stared unblinking, tears tracking down my cheeks. The smell was suffocating now, a copper tang that coated my tongue. I realized with a nauseating certainty that if I looked away to run, it would cross the remaining distance before I could take a dozen steps. I began to walk backward. I dragged the crash cart with me, using it as a clumsy shield. The wheels squealed against the concrete. I tripped over a discarded piece of wood, but kept my eyes locked on the gaunt ship. The burning in my eyes was torture. I had to blink again. 20 feet. I could see details now. The texture on its body wasn't fabric. It was slick, wet mud, plastered over unnatural angles of bone. It had no face, just a smooth plane of that same dark, wet earth. I let go of the cart. I couldn't walk backward fast enough. I spun around and ran. I sprinted down the corridor, abandoning the equipment, abandoning caution. I expected to feel long, damp fingers close around my throat at any second. I didn't look back. I slammed my shoulder into the heavy fire doors leading back to the active hospital, bursting through them and falling onto the linoleum of the bright, bustling hallway. I scrambled to my feet and kept running until I reached the staff break room. I shoved the door open, threw myself inside, and locked the deadbolt. I stood there, gasping for air, clutching my knees. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed a steady, comforting tune. The room smelled like stale popcorn and bleach. Normal hospital smells. I pressed my back against the wall, listening. Nothing came crashing against the door. No alarm sounded. The corridor outside remained quiet. I slowly let out a breath. I walked over to the coffee machine on the counter. My hands were trembling so much I could barely hold the glass pot. I poured a mug of black coffee, letting the steam rise into my face, letting the warmth soak into my skin. My heart rate started to slow down, replaced by the embarrassing realization that I had just ditched a $1,000 piece of equipment because I got spooked by the dark. I rationalized that it was just a shadow or a bad pipe, and that the long shift was making me see things. I took a sip of the coffee, feeling the heat travel down my throat. I turned around to face the door, ready to unlock it and face the music. The door to the break room has a small rectangular window set at eye level, reinforced with wire mesh. I looked at the glass. Streaked across the bottom pane, drying under the harsh fluorescent light, were long smeared handprints made of dark, wet mud. They weren't on the hallway side. They were on the inside of the glass, in the locked room with me. Dropping a solid steel wrench onto a linoleum floor shouldn't sound like it landed on wet meat. I work as a medical equipment technician. My job involves repairing, organizing, and maintaining the vast inventory of monitors, 4 pumps, and diagnostic machines that keep the hospital running. Much of my time is spent in Supply Closet B, a windowless, cramped room tucked in the basement of the North Tower. It is a suffocating space. The walls are lined with floor-to-ceiling metal racks packed tight with snarls of EKG leads, spare batteries, and dusty manuals. The ventilation system is weak, leaving the air stale and warm. It was dead quiet that weekend, right around 3 a.m. The rest of the hospital was running on skeleton crews. I was sitting cross-legged on the floor in the narrowest aisle, untangling a giant knot of telemetry cables. My lower back ached. I grabbed my wrench from my tool belt to pry open a stubborn plastic casing on a monitor. It slipped from my fingers. Instead of the sharp, ringing clatter of metal hitting hard tile, the impact made a soft, squelching noise. It sounded like a butcher tossing a slab of beef onto a prep table. I stared at the wrench. It sat innocently on the dry, clean linoleum. I figured there was some acoustic dead zone in the cramped room. Maybe a loose tile with moisture trapped underneath. I picked the tool back up, shaking my head. The isolation was getting to me. "Hey, excuse me." The voice came from the next aisle over, separated from me by a towering rack of defunct ventilators. I recognized the tone immediately. It was Dr. Evans, one of the senior attending physicians from cardiology. He had a distinct, slightly raspy baritone. "I'm looking for a lithium pack for a portable ultrasound," Dr. Evans said. I didn't bother standing up. "They're on the 3rd shelf to your left, Doc, in the blue plastic bins." Silence. The hum of the overhead lights seemed to grow louder. "I'm looking for a lithium pack for a portable ultrasound," Dr. Evans repeated. The delivery was identical. There was no variation in pitch, no subtle shift in annoyance that he hadn't found it. It was the exact same cadence, right down to the slight pause before the word portable. "Third shelf," I called out, feeling a prickle of unease. "Right side of the aisle you're in." From the other side of the rack, a cough echoed. It was a wet, rattling noise, the sound of fluid in the lungs breaking apart. But it was just a cough. There was no intake of air preceding it. No sharp inhale, just a sudden expulsion of sound. "I'm looking for a lithium pack for a portable ultrasound," the voice stated again. My blood ran cold as my hand tightened around the handle of the wrench. I sat there in the dark, my mind racing to find any earthly explanation for what I was hearing. A human speaks by pushing air out of their lungs. A human must draw breath to cough. The entity standing one aisle over was not drawing breath. The voice lacked the subtle resonance of a living chest cavity. It sounded flat, like a high-quality audio recording being played back in an empty room. I stopped breathing through my nose to eliminate any noise I might make. I pressed my back against the metal shelving. Through the narrow gap between a stack of cardboard boxes and a blood pressure machine, I tried to see into the next aisle. The overhead light cast sharp shadows onto the floor. I looked for a pair of shoes. I looked for the hem of a lab coat. The linoleum on the other side of the rack was bare. The wet cough played again. Just the output. No inhale. "I'm looking for a lithium pack for a portable ultrasound." I realized the voice wasn't searching for equipment. It was searching for a response. It was baiting me. If I spoke again, it would know exactly where I was sitting. My muscles locked rigid. A cold sweat broke across my forehead, stinging my eyes. I didn't shift my weight. I didn't swallow the dry lump in my throat. I sat on the floor, surrounded by tangled wires, trapped in a windowless room with something that wore a dead man's voice. For an hour, the recording looped. Sometimes, the gap between the sentences was 10 seconds. Sometimes it was 5 minutes. Not knowing when it would speak next kept my pulse redlining. The wet cough punctuated the silence at random intervals. I stared at the blank tiles through the crack in the shelves, praying I wouldn't see something crouched down to look back at me. Around 4:30 a.m., the voice stopped. I didn't move. I stayed pinned to the floor, my legs cramping in agony, until the digital clock on the wall rolled over to 6 a.m. The shift change alarm blared in the hallway outside. The sound of distant chatter and rolling carts filtered through the heavy door. I forced myself up. My joints popped. I left my tools on the floor, walked to the door, and pushed it open, stepping out into the bright, blinding fluorescent light of the main corridor. The sudden drop in tension left me completely dizzy. The anomaly was contained to that room. I walked to the front desk to punch out at the time terminal. The morning receptionist, a cheerful woman named Sarah, was sorting patient files. I swiped my badge, the machine beeping in confirmation. "Rough night?" Sarah asked, noticing my pale face. "Just tired," I mumbled. "Hey, did Dr. Evans come down this way earlier?" Sarah paused, holding a manila folder halfway to a tray. She looked at me, her expression shifting to mild confusion. "Evans?" she asked softly. "No, he didn't." She turned back to her files, organizing them with slow, deliberate movements. "They took his name off the active roster yesterday," she said, her voice dropping to a low, casual murmur. "He died in a horrific pileup on the interstate 3 days ago." I work in the sprawling labyrinth of the utility tunnels, where the air is stale and nobody hears you scream. Mercy General sits on top of a concrete maze that spans 3 city blocks. The sub-basement connects the old boiler rooms, the central laundry hub, and the waste management compactors. Down there, the walls are stained with decades of hard water runoff. Exposed pipes line the ceiling, running like thick metal veins, carrying steam, water, and oxygen to the floors above. The lighting is sparse. Their bulbs are spaced 50 feet apart, leaving long stretches of the corridors bathed in a murky twilight. You get used to the solitude. You get used to the damp heat radiating from the steam lines. It is a job where you punch in, put your head down, and push a mop until your shift ends. My cart is a heavy plastic rig holding twin buckets, an industrial wringer, and shelves stocked with bleach, degreaser, and floor wax. Pushing it over the uneven concrete requires real effort. The wheels always drift to the left. I was assigned to Deep Clean Sector 4, a forgotten dead-end corridor housing decommissioned electrical panels. The ambient heat down there usually hovers around 80 degrees. I wore a thin short-sleeved uniform shirt, sweat already gathering on my collar just from the walkover. I parked my cart near the first junction and reached out to grab a rag tucked behind a low-hanging hot water pipe. I lost my footing on a patch of uneven floor and threw my left hand against the pipe to steady myself. My bare palm slapped against the metal. It should have burned me. The pipe was part of the main boiler return. Instead, a shocking, agonizing cold bit into my skin. I recoiled, pulling my hand back. I rubbed my fingers together. They were coated in a thick, freezing film of grease. It felt like sticking my hand into a tub of frozen lard. The chill seeped deep into my knuckles, making the joints ache in seconds. I wiped my hand furiously on my uniform pants, but the residue clung to my skin, refusing to come off. I looked at the pipe. In the dim light, the metal looked normal. No frost, no condensation. I turned back to my cart to grab a bottle of industrial solvent. That was when I saw the paper. Clipped to the metal handle of my mop wringer was a laminated sheet of white printer paper. Condensation beaded on the plastic surface. It had not been there when I filled the buckets at the janitorial station 5 minutes ago. Nobody had walked past me. The corridor stretched empty in both directions, silent except for the low vibration of the building's machinery. I wiped my cold, greasy hand on my pants one more time and unclipped the paper. The text was typed in a standard, boring font. It looked like a generic notice from Human Resources, the kind they tape up in the break room about vacation hours. The heading read, Maintenance Protocol for Sector 4. Below it were 3 short lines. Rule 1. Keep your eyes on the floor tiles while applying solvent. Rule 2. Ignore any voices coming from the ventilation shafts. Rule 4. If the overhead lights dim and flicker twice, walk backwards. There was no Rule 3. I stared at the laminated sheet. The cold from the greasy film on my hand seemed to spread up my forearm. I desperately wanted to believe the day shift guys were just messing with me. The day shift guys were always messing with the night crew, trying to spook us. I tossed the paper onto the bottom shelf of my cart next to the trash bags. I grabbed my mop. I needed to finish this sector and get back to the main staging area. I dipped the mop head into the hot, soapy water. I squeezed it through the wringer. I slapped the wet cotton onto the concrete. The familiar smell of lemon and bleach rose into the air, masking the damp, metallic odor of the tunnels. I gripped the wooden handle. I pushed the mop forward in wide, sweeping figure eights. Left to right, right to left. The rhythm grounded me. I let my mind focus on the spreading foam, the wet trail left behind on the porous concrete. Work is a reliable anchor when your mind wants to drift into panic. Above me, the bare bulb dimmed. It flickered once. It flickered twice. The corridor returned to its normal murky twilight. I stopped moving. The wooden handle of the mop felt rough against my palms. I stared down at the wet concrete. Rule 4. If the overhead lights dim and flicker twice, walk backwards. I refused to entertain the joke. I closed my eyes tight, took a deep breath, and pushed the mop forward again. Left to right. 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 Left. I scrubbed at a stubborn scuff mark with unnecessary force. I leaned into the work, letting the repetition build a wall between myself and the growing unease in my gut. I would not look up. I would not play along with a prank. I kept my eyes trained on the floor just ahead of my boots. Then I saw the shadows. The dim bulb cast long, distorted silhouettes of the concrete support pillars across the floor. As I mopped, I watched the shadow of the nearest pillar shift. It did not just elongate. It peeled away from the concrete surface. The dog shape tore itself free from the pillar, pulling apart like thick, sticky tar. It stepped into the center of the aisle. The shadow had no mass, no features, but it blocked out the floor tiles beneath it. It stood between me and the exit. It was a void of light, shaped roughly like a person, but too tall, too jagged around the edges. I stopped moving entirely, my hands locking around the mop handle. I watched another shadow peel away from a pillar 20 feet down the hall, stepping into the walkway. Then another. They were emerging from the architecture, standing completely motionless in the gloom. I let go of the mop. It hit the floor with a wet slap. I did not walk backwards. I turned around and sprinted. I ditched the rig and all the supplies. I ran down the corridor, heading for the emergency maintenance stairwell at the far end of the sector. I did not look over my shoulder. The air around me grew freezing cold, matching the grease on my hand. I hit the heavy metal fire door at a full run, throwing my shoulder into the crash bar. The door gave way. I stumbled into the concrete stairwell, scrambling up the steps 2 at a time. I climbed 3 flights until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. I pushed open the door to the ground floor and burst into the main lobby. The transition was jarring. The lobby was bright, lit by towering windows welcoming the early morning sun. Patients sat quietly on cushioned chairs, reading magazines. A nurse walked by pushing a medication cart. A small coffee kiosk hummed in the corner. I walked over to an empty wooden bench near the main entrance and collapsed. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, letting my head hang between my arms. I pulled air into my burning lungs. The bright, sterile normalcy of the lobby finally grounded me. I brushed off the panic as a mix of exhaustion and the creepy isolation playing tricks on my mind. I sat back against the bench, exhaling a long, shaky breath. My left hand still felt numb from the cold pipe. I reached into the pocket of my uniform pants to grab a tissue to wipe off the remaining grease. My fingers brushed against something stiff and smooth. I pulled it out. It was a crumpled piece of laminated paper. Condensation still clung to the plastic. It was the same notice I had tossed onto the bottom shelf of my cart 3 floors down. The typed text was gone. In its place, written in an erratic, messy scrawl that looked like it had been carved into the plastic with a dirty fingernail, was one new rule. It followed you upstairs. The vital sign monitor by the bed stopped functioning normally, opting to emit a melodic, rhythmic whistle instead of standard alerts. I work in palliative care. Our ward is designed to be quiet, a place where the end is managed with whatever dignity we can muster. Most of our rooms are standard patient setups, but Room 4 is different. Room 4 is an isolation unit, built for patients with aggressive, communicable conditions. It operates on negative pressure. When you walk in, you pass through a small antechamber where you don protective gear. The main door is thick glass, bordered by airtight rubber seals. Inside, the walls are lined with heavy plastic curtains that create a second barrier around the bed. Being in there feels like being sealed inside a plastic bag. The air is filtered and recycled, carrying a sterile, chemical bite. My patient was a man named Mr. Elias, a retired teacher who had outlived everyone he ever knew. He had been unresponsive for 2 days, his body quietly shutting down. I spent my shift doing the necessary rituals, checking 4 lines, adjusting his position to prevent bed sores, moistening his lips with a sponge. The room was supposed to be kept at a warm 72 degrees to maintain his core temperature. I was charting his vitals at the small computer terminal in the corner of the room when the monitor changed. The steady, monotonous chirp of his heart rate vanished. Instead, the machine produced a clear, melodic whistling tone. It sounded like a person whistling a nursery rhyme through their teeth. It held a tune for a few seconds, paused, and repeated. I stared at the screen. The numbers were stable. His heart rate was normal. The machine was simply projecting the wrong output. I figured it was a software glitch. The hospital relied on ancient, refurbished equipment, and weird malfunctions were just part of the job. I typed a note for maintenance into the system. Then I noticed the cold. It did not happen all at once. It started near the floor, a creeping chill that wrapped around my ankles beneath the protective paper gown. Over the next 45 minutes, the temperature in the sealed room plummeted. The warmth drained out of the air, replaced by a bitter, biting cold that made the joints in my fingers ache. I checked the digital thermostat on the wall. It read 72 degrees. I hugged my arms across my chest, shivering. The cold was unnatural. It felt damp, sinking right through my scrubs and my skin, settling into my bones. I walked over to the thick glass door to look out into the hallway. The edges of the glass were fogging up. Tiny, fractal patterns of frost were beginning to form along the rubber seals. I could see my breath pluming in the air in front of my face. The heavy plastic door to the antechamber hissed open. Dr. Miller, the attending physician for the night shift, stepped into the room. He wore the standard yellow isolation gown, gloves, and a surgical mask. He didn't look at me. He walked straight to the foot of Mr. Elias's bed and picked up the physical paper chart hanging from the rail. He stood with his back to me, reading the pages. The whistling from the monitor looped again. I rubbed my arms, trying to generate friction. "Hey, doctor," I said, forcing a nervous chuckle. "Did maintenance leave the freezer door open down the hall? The thermostat says it's warm, but it feels like it's snowing in here." Dr. Miller did not answer. He did not turn his head. He continued staring down at the clipboard in his hands. "Doctor?" I asked, my voice losing its humor. He reached out his right arm to turn a page on the clipboard. I watched his arm move. The motion was wrong. When a person reaches forward, their elbow bends outward, away from their body. Dr. Miller's arm did not do that. The joint buckled inward, bending the wrong way, the angle sharp and unnatural. The sleeve of his yellow gown pulled taut over the inverted joint as his hand manipulated the paper. My breath caught in my throat. I stopped rubbing my arms. He turned another page. His left hand shifted. The fingers gripping the clipboard were too long. The knuckles bent backward, mirroring the grotesque angle of his elbow. He was wearing Dr. Miller's clothes. He had Dr. Miller's height and build, but the anatomy underneath the yellow gown was alien. I took a slow, silent step backward. The plastic curtains hung from the ceiling just behind the computer terminal, separating the supply shelves from the main room. I slipped behind the thick, opaque plastic barrier. I pressed my back against the wall, pulling my knees up slightly. The cold was agonizing now. My teeth chattered, snapping together with an audible clicking noise. I clamped my jaw shut, biting the inside of my cheek to force silence. I hid in the corner, staring at the blurred silhouette of the thing standing at the foot of the bed through the frosted plastic curtain. I waited. The monitor whistled its awful melodic tune. The air grew colder. My fingers lost all feeling. I watched the silhouette for what felt like hours. It never shifted its weight. It never looked around the room. It just stood there, holding the chart with its backward bending joints, facing the comatose patient. I prayed the negative pressure seal would hold. I clung to a fading hope that this was all just a side effect of sleep deprivation, a mental fracture that would heal the moment the sun came up. The silhouette finally moved. It placed the clipboard back on the rail. It turned, walking with a disjointed, rigid gait toward the antechamber. The heavy door hissed open, and the shape disappeared into the hall. I did not move from my hiding spot. I stayed huddled behind the curtain, shivering violently, until the digital clock on the computer terminal struck 6 a.m. The door hissed open again. I flinched, pressing myself harder into the corner. "Hello?" A voice called out. It was Dr. Aris, the chief of medicine. He was a kind older man with a booming voice and a gentle demeanor. He stood near the entrance, holding a fresh cup of coffee, looking around the empty room. The temperature in the room was already beginning to normalize. "Are you in here?" he asked, stepping toward the bed. I let out a sob of relief. I pushed the plastic curtain aside and stumbled out. My legs were stiff from the cold. "I'm here," I gasped, wrapping my arms around myself. "Dr. Aris, thank God. Something is wrong with Miller. Something is wrong with this room." Dr. Aris turned to face me. He looked perfectly normal. His eyes were warm and concerned. His posture was relaxed, familiar, and undeniably human. Seeing another living person, instantly shattered the tension in my chest. "It's okay," Dr. Reese said in his deep, soothing tone. "Take a breath. You look exhausted. Can you hand me Mr. Elias's chart, please?" I nodded, feeling foolish from my panic. I walked to the foot of the bed, picked up the clipboard from the rail, and handed it to him. Dr. Aris took the chart. He looked at me, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He smiled warmly to reassure me. His lips parted, pulling back wide. He had no teeth. Behind his lips, there were no individual incisors or canines. The gums were lined with a single, continuous, perfectly smooth ridge of solid white bone. It was 1998 when I took the graveyard runs, back when the roof was a lawless place. I worked as an oxygen delivery driver for the county hospital network. My job was simple but grueling. I moved massive, pressurized steel cylinders from the basement loading docks to the various wards, replacing the empty tanks with fresh ones. The worst route on the schedule was the helipad run. The helipad was situated on the flat, sprawling roof of the North Tower, 15 stories above the street. It was a vast, open expanse of reinforced concrete, marked only by the faded painted circle in the center and a small brick blockhouse that contained the emergency stairwell and the service elevator. There were no guardrails. The edge of the roof just dropped off into the dark. It was a Tuesday in early April, and a severe storm had rolled in from the coast. The rain was coming down in thick, blinding sheets, driven sideways by wind that threatened to knock me off my feet. I pushed a flatbed trolley loaded with 4 fresh cylinders out of the blockhouse and into the storm. The wind howled across the flat concrete, cutting through my waterproof jacket like it was made of paper. The wheels of the trolley kept catching in the deep expansion joints carved into the roof, forcing me to lean all my weight against the metal handle just to keep the cart moving. I reached the storage shed near the landing zone, swapped the tanks, and began the long trek back to the blockhouse. The rain was so dense I could barely see the brick structure through the gloom. Halfway across the roof, I swallowed, trying to clear the rainwater from my throat. A sudden, overwhelming taste coated the back of my tongue. It was the taste of stale, burning ash. It bloomed in my mouth, thick and gritty, coating my teeth like I had just chewed on a mouthful of charcoal from a dead fire. The flavor was so intense it made my eyes water. I gagged, spitting onto the wet concrete, but the taste clung to the roof of my mouth. It tasted like sulfur, burnt hair, and dry dust. I shook my head, fighting down the nausea. I blamed my diet. I lived on gas station coffee and cheap diner food, and the stress of the job was giving me a brutal stomach ulcer. I figured the exertion in the cold air had triggered a bout of severe acid reflux, pushing bile and stomach acid up into my throat, warping my taste buds. I spat again, wiping my mouth with the back of my soaked glove, and pushed the trolley forward. The blockhouse loomed ahead in the dark. Above the heavy metal door was a single caged sodium light. It cast a sickly yellowish glow onto the wet concrete and illuminated the small window set into the upper half of the door. The window was made of thick, wire mesh reinforced glass, highly reflective in the dark. I pushed the trolley toward the door, keeping my head down to shield my face from the driving rain. The wind whipped my hood against my cheeks. I kept my eyes focused on the puddles forming around my boots. As I closed the last 20 feet, I caught my reflection in the glass of the door out of the corner of my eye. I stopped walking. The trolley ground to a halt. The rain pounded against my shoulders, but a cold spike of dread shot through my chest, freezing me in place. I was bent forward, both hands tightly gripping the metal push bar of the cart, my shoulders hunched against the wind. The reflection in the glass was standing perfectly straight. I stared at the wet concrete at my feet. The taste of burning ash surged in my mouth again, stronger this time, carrying the distinct flavor of charred meat. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the yellow light, a distortion in the cheap wire mesh glass, or exhaustion playing games with my peripheral vision. I kept my eyes on the ground. I did not look up. I knew, with a primal animal certainty, that if I raised my head and locked eyes with the reflection, the glass would cease to be a barrier. I slowly turned my head just a fraction of an inch, using only my extreme peripheral vision to track the shape in the door. The reflection was not wearing a hood. Its arms were raised, elbows tucked into its sides, hands cupped together near its chest. Inside the cupped hands was a small, vibrant orange flame. The rain was pouring in sheets, washing down the glass pane in rivers of water. The wind was violently whipping across the roof, but the flame in the reflection's hands did not flicker. It burned steady and bright, casting a localized warm glow against a face I refused to look at. I gripped the handle of the cart until my knuckles ached. I began to talk to myself, muttering under my breath, telling my legs to move, telling my brain to ignore the bizarre anomaly happening 10 feet away. I just needed to open the door. I just needed to get inside the stairwell, out of the storm, out of the dark. I let go of the cart and took a step toward the door. The reflection did not mirror my step. It stood motionless, cradling the unnatural flame. I kept my chin tucked down on my chest. I watched the toes of my boots edge closer to the doorframe. The taste of ash was suffocating, drying out my throat so badly I could not swallow. I reached out my right hand, feeling for the heavy metal handle below the glass. I refused to look up. I squeezed my eyes into narrow slits, staring only at the rusted metal of the handle. My wet fingers extended. The back of my knuckles brushed against the cold, wet glass pane of the window. The glass was not cold. A wave of searing heat radiated through the wet pane, pressing against unseen blistering skin just as the glass cracked. Something warm and red was dripping from the ceiling hatch, and the elevator wasn't moving. I work in the neonatal intensive care unit, located on the 5th floor of the South Tower. Moving fragile, specialized equipment between the pharmacy, the supply vaults, and the ICU is a constant chore. On a quiet Wednesday around 4 a.m., the main staff elevators were shut down for routine cable inspections. I was forced to use Service Elevator 9, an ancient wood-paneled box tucked away in a dusty service corridor that felt completely detached from the sterile, bright environment of the hospital. The elevator was small, meant for freight carts and laundry bins. The wood veneer was deeply scratched, and the overhead fluorescent light hummed with a failing, erratic rhythm. I rolled a metal cart loaded with specialized premature infant formula and fresh, sterilized linens into the cab. The doors slid shut with a grinding metallic scrape. I pressed the button for the 5th floor. The cab jerked upward. It rose smoothly for about 10 seconds before a violent shudder tore through the walls. The elevator halted violently. The lights flickered, dimmed to a dull amber glow, and stabilized. I froze in place, gripping the handle of the supply cart. I waited for the automated voice to announce a delay, or for the cab to resume its climb. Nothing happened. The silence in the small box was absolute. Then, the sensation began. It started as a mild dizziness behind my eyes, but within seconds, it escalated into a profound, terrifying shift in my equilibrium. The floor beneath my rubber-soled shoes was perfectly flat. I was standing upright, but my inner ear began to scream that the room was tilting. It felt as though the entire elevator cab was slowly rotating backward on an invisible axis. Gravity felt wrong. The pressure on the soles of my feet vanished, shifting to the front of my shins as if I was standing on a steep incline. My brain interpreted the space around me as a vertical drop. I felt like I was suspended over a bottomless pit, hanging sideways, and that if I let go of the cart, I would fall endlessly into the wall behind me. Nausea rolled through my stomach. I clamped my eyes closed, fighting to reset my equilibrium and convince my brain that the floor was horizontal. I reached out blindly and grabbed the thick wooden handrail bolted to the side wall. I gripped it tight, my knuckles turning white, holding on as if it were a lifeline over a canyon. "Okay," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's just a hydraulic stabilization error." I focused on my professional training, leaning heavily into routine to build a psychological wall against the rising panic. I began to recite the hospital's emergency response manual aloud. "In the event of a cab stall, remain calm," I said, my voice echoing in the small space. Do not attempt to force the inner doors. Engage the emergency call button and wait for facility personnel. I opened my eyes, fighting through the dizzying illusion that the room was tipped on its side. I looked at the floor to ground myself. A single drop of fluid landed on the white linoleum tile near my shoe. I looked up. The ceiling of the elevator was comprised of metal grating and a square wooden trapdoor used for maintenance access. Another drop fell. It hit the shoulder of my scrub top. I touched the fabric. The liquid was thick and incredibly warm. I looked at my fingers in the amber light. It was dark red. It was not hydraulic fluid. It was not grease. Above the trapdoor, in the pitch-black elevator shaft, something shifted. It was a slow, deliberate movement. The sound of fabric sliding against rusted metal cables. The vertigo intensified, pulling at my stomach. The sensation of falling sideways grew so that my knees buckled. I dropped to the floor, clinging to the wooden rail with one hand, convinced I was hanging over an abyss. I ignored the emergency protocol. I did not push the call button. I did not want whatever was in the shaft above to know I was down here. I dragged myself across the floor, fighting the sickening illusion of gravity until I reached the metal doors. I dug my fingernails into the thick rubber seam where the doors met. I braced my boots against the floor. I pulled. My muscles burned. The gears in the door track resisted, grinding against my effort. I clamped my jaw shut, refusing to make a sound, pouring every ounce of strength I had into my arms. The rubber seal popped. A narrow gap of darkness opened between the doors. I wedged a thick plastic bottle of infant formula from the cart into the gap to keep it from snapping shut. I wedged my hands deeper into the opening and pulled again. The doors gave way, sliding open just enough for me to fit through. Beyond the inner doors was the rough concrete wall of the elevator shaft, and about 2 feet down, the landing of the 4th floor. The outer doors of the 4th floor were older, manual swing doors. I reached through the gap, found the latch, and pushed it open. I squeezed through the opening, scraping my ribs against the metal frame, and tumbled out onto the carpeted hallway of the 4th floor. I scrambled away from the open shaft, crawling on my hands and knees until my back hit the opposite wall of the corridor. I lay there on the carpet, gasping for air. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by distant exit signs, but it was quiet. It was empty. The nausea vanished the moment I crawled out of the elevator. The floor of the hallway was rock solid, and I pressed my hands against the carpet just to reassure myself I was back in the real world. I let my head fall back against the wall, taking deep, steadying breaths, letting the adrenaline run its course. I reached into the pocket of my scrub pants and pulled out my phone, intending to turn on the flashlight to navigate the dark corridor. I tapped the screen to wake the device. It did not open to the lock screen. It opened directly to my camera roll. Displayed on the glowing screen was the most recent photograph. It was a crystal clear, high-resolution image of my own terrified, upturned face, illuminated by the amber light of the elevator. The angle was looking straight down at me. The timestamp on the photo indicated it had been taken from 50 feet up, inside the pitch-black elevator shaft, exactly 10 seconds ago. I work as a night shift security guard for the main hospital campus. The job consists of walking miles of empty hallways, checking locked doors, and swiping a plastic badge against mounted wall sensors to prove I am doing my rounds. The worst part of the route happens during the 3 a.m. changeover. This is when I have to patrol the ground floor atrium, which serves as the central cafeteria for the entire hospital network. The cafeteria is a cavernous, wide-open space. It is large enough to seat 500 people at once. When you walk in during the middle of the night, the vast, unbroken expanse of the room feels aggressive. There are no walls to break up the room, just rows and rows of long plastic tables. The chairs are always stacked upside down on top of the tables, making them look like the exposed ribs of some giant animal. One entire side of the room is made of floor-to-ceiling glass windows that face a dark, empty street. The only light comes from a row of vending machines glowing against the far back wall, casting long, distorted shadows across the linoleum floor. Standing in the doorway, I always feel a crawling sense of agoraphobia. There is too much open air. There are too many shadowed corners where a person could hide, yet no place for me to take cover if I needed. I stood near the main entrance doors, holding my clipboard, checking off the time. I kept my eyes focused on the paper. I always told myself the odds of an actual intruder being inside the cafeteria at this hour were 0. The doors required a specialized keycard to open. The exterior windows were reinforced glass. Every protocol I'd been trained on suggested I was completely alone. As I signed my initials on the paper, a movement caught my attention. In the extreme corner of my vision, far off to my right, a shadow darted between 2 tables. It was about 80 feet away, near the glass windows. It was a tall, jagged shape, moving with a fluid speed that did not look natural. I stopped writing. I kept my head still and stared at the spot where the movement had occurred. The space between the tables was empty. The weak light from the vending machines illuminated nothing but plastic chairs and bare floor tiles. I took a slow breath, dismissing the spike of fear in my chest. I told myself it was just a trick of the light. A car must have driven past on the street outside, its headlights sweeping across the glass and projecting a weird silhouette onto the furniture. I told myself it was an inevitability of the job. 9 times out of 10, shadows at night are just stray headlights. I raised my hand to tap the sensor on the wall with my badge. My security radio was clipped to the shoulder strap of my uniform. The hospital is located near a police precinct, and sometimes the radio receiver picks up bleed over from the dispatch channels. Without warning, the radio speaker emitted a sharp, loud burst of static interference. The noise echoed across the vast, empty cafeteria, bouncing off the glass windows. The moment the static broke the silence, the shadow moved again. It did not dart this time. It stretched. 1 second, the jagged shape was crouching near the windows. A fraction of a second later, a towering mass of tangled, sharp angles was standing 20 feet away from me. It moved faster than my eyes could process, drawn in a straight, violent line directly toward the source of the noise. I couldn't make sense of the shape. It had no face, no distinct limbs. It looked like a cluster of broken wire hangers covered in dark cloth, vibrating with intense coiled energy. The top of the shape reached 8 feet into the air. It did not have eyes. It had moved the exact moment the radio made a sound. It was hunting by hearing. I held my breath, careful not to drop my clipboard. I did not reach for the flashlight on my belt. I stopped moving every muscle in my body. I locked my knees. I tightened my grip on the pen. I stopped pulling air into my lungs. The radio went silent. The jagged shape stood 20 feet away, motionless. The silence in the massive room returned, but it felt thick and suffocating. I stood like a statue in the doorway. The digital clock on the wall near the registers read 3:14 a.m. I knew that if I turned and ran, my rubber-soled boots would squeak against the polished linoleum. I knew my uniform shirt would rustle. The thing was too fast. If I made a sound, it would cross the remaining 20 feet before I could even turn the door handle. I refused to move. I made no attempt to escape. Minutes began to drag by. The pain of holding still set in quickly. The muscles in my calves began to burn, demanding to stretch. Sweat trickled down from my hairline, pooling hot and irritating at the corner of my eye. I could not blink to clear it. I stared straight ahead, watching the shadow mass out of the corner of my eye. At 3:35 a.m., the compressor motor in one of the vending machines kicked on. It generated a low humming vibration. The shadow shape snapped its attention toward the back wall. It blurred across the room, covering 100 feet in a blink, stopping right in front of the illuminated machine. Its blinding, terrifying speed made my stomach drop. I used the humming noise of the machine to cover the sound of my breathing. I opened my mouth and let air escape in a slow, agonizing trickle. I inhaled just enough oxygen to keep myself from passing out. The clock ticked forward. 4:10 a.m., then 4:35 a.m. The vending machine turned off. The silence fell over the room again. I was trapped in an endurance test. My legs went numb from the knees down. My lower back ached with a dull, throbbing pain. I focused all my willpower on the simple act of existing without making a sound. I counted every second like a prayer, waiting for the 5 a.m. shift change to break the silence. Someone would open the doors. Someone would make noise outside. By 4:50 a.m., my vision began to swim from the strain. I stared at the space in front of the vending machines. The shadow was gone. I scanned the back wall, relying only on small eye movements. The floor was clear. The spaces between the tables were empty. I had not heard the kitchen door swing open. I had not heard anything move. But the jagged mass was nowhere in my field of view. I kept my body rigid. I did not shift my weight to ease the pain in my legs. My neck was stiff, the muscles cramping from holding the exact same angle for over an hour and a half. I decided to relieve the tension in my neck just a fraction of an inch. I slowly, carefully tilted my head back, looking toward the ceiling above the doorway. A freezing drop of thick, viscous fluid fell from the darkness directly above me. It landed dead center on the bare skin of my collarbone, smelling like raw, spoiled meat. My name is David. I have run 2,000 magnetic resonance imaging scans in my career, and the machine has never turned itself on before today. I work the graveyard shift in radiology. The imaging suite is located in the lowest sub-basement of the hospital. It is built like a bunker to contain the intense magnetic fields generated by the equipment. The primary scanning room is a small, windowless box lined with copper shielding. In the center of the room sits the scanner, a huge white cylinder that dominates the space. Attached to the scanning room is the control booth, separated by a thick pane of leaded glass. The control booth is nothing more than a tight closet. You sit in a padded chair, surrounded by computer monitors, watching patients slide into the tube through the glass. It gets claustrophobic very fast. The air in the booth is always bone dry and chilled to protect the computer towers from overheating. My shift dragged into Friday morning, and by 2 a.m., the department was totally deserted. I was sitting at the control console, rubbing my face. I was fighting off a severe sinus infection, and the pressure in my head was giving me a dull, persistent ache behind my eyes. I blamed my fatigue and the sickness for the general sense of unease creeping up my neck. I looked through the observation window. The scanning room was empty. The lights inside the circular opening of the machine were dark. Then, the pressure in the room shifted. It felt like a sudden, severe drop in altitude during a flight. The air grew thick, pressing hard against my eardrums. My ears popped with a sharp, painful release that made me wince and grab the sides of my head. I swallowed hard, trying to clear the sensation. I suspected the building ventilation system was pulling too much air out of the small room, messing with the air pressure. I looked back through the thick glass window. The machine was on. The internal lights ringing the inside of the tube were glowing a bright, sterile white. The mechanized patient table had extended outward, protruding into the room, ready to accept a body. I looked down at the computer console. The operating system showed the scanner was in standby mode. No power was being routed to the magnet. But through the glass, I could see the machine vibrating. It produced a low, rhythmic hum that I could feel radiating through the floorboards and up into my teeth. I stood up from the chair. As I moved, I noticed a small yellow sticky note attached to the plastic bezel of my primary monitor. I did not put it there. The handwriting was neat, written in black ink. Rule 1. Do not acknowledge the extra patient. I stared at the note. My exhausted mind could barely make sense of the words. The radiology department has strict, unbending rules, but they involve metal safety protocols and contrast dye allergies, not cryptic warnings on office supplies. I looked through the window again. The scanning room was still empty. The white table was bare. A heavy, suffocating panic took hold in my gut. The pressure in my ears spiked again, causing another stab of pain deep in my sinuses. I wanted proof of what was happening. I wanted to document this malfunction so I could show the morning technician I was not losing my mind. I pulled my phone out of my uniform pocket. I opened the camera application, switched to video mode, and held it up to the thick glass window. The digital screen displayed the empty room and the glowing machine. I watched the phone screen. Lying on the extended table of the scanner, clear as day on the digital display, was a figure. It was a person, but their skin was a pale, sickening gray. The flesh was peeling away in wet strips along the arms and legs. The limbs were drawn up close to the chest in a tight fetal position. The head was tilted back at a severe angle, staring directly up at the ceiling lights. I lowered the phone and looked through the glass with my own eyes. The table was completely empty. I raised the phone again. The figure was there, lying perfectly still on the screen. As I watched the digital display, the mechanized table began to slide backward. The machine was feeding the gray, peeling figure into the center of the magnetic tube. I backed away from the console. The pressure in the booth was crushing now, making it difficult to draw a full breath. My lungs burned. I turned around, grabbed the metal handle of the solid reinforced door leading out into the main hallway, and threw it open. I bolted out of the booth, stumbling into the wide, well-lit corridor of the hospital basement. I grabbed the door handle with both hands and slammed the solid door shut behind me, pulling it tight until the steel latch clicked into the frame. I stood in the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air pressure out here was normal. My ears popped again, clearing the pain from my head. I pressed my back against the wall next to the door, clutching my chest. My heart was racing, beating a frantic, violent rhythm against my ribs. I closed my eyes, taking deep, greedy breaths of the clean, normal hospital air. I stood in the hall trying to catch my breath, convincing myself that a phone camera glitch and my own sleep-deprived brain had just caused a major hallucination. I opened my eyes and looked at the small, square observation window set into the door I had just closed. The glass was thick, designed to stop stray radiation. From the other side of the glass, inside the empty, sealed booth, a sound started. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping against the glass pane. I stared at the window. Nothing was standing in the booth, but the tapping continued. It was precise. It matched the exact, frantic pace of my own racing heart. Tripping over a concrete parking bumper should not make the shadows whisper. I am a trauma surgeon at the main city hospital. I had just finished a brutal 36-hour rotation in the emergency room. My legs felt like they were made of wet sand. My eyes burned from staring at monitors under the harsh fluorescent lights. When you stay awake that long, the world starts to feel thin, like paper you could punch a hole through. I clocked out a little past 4 in the morning. I walked out of the bright, sterile lobby and into the freezing night air, wrapping my coat tight around my scrubs. The employee parking structure is a vast, multi-level expanse of concrete located 2 blocks away from the main hospital. It is an open-air garage, meaning the wind from the city streets blows right through the open sides. At 4 in the morning, the place is deserted. The sodium lights bolted to the low ceiling cast a sickly, flickering orange glow over the empty parking spaces. The floor is stained with decades of motor oil and rust. My car was parked on the 4th level, tucked away in the far corner near a thick structural pillar. I was exhausted. I was not paying attention to the ground. I was digging in my coat pocket for my keys, walking blindly across the empty lanes. The toe of my shoe caught the sharp edge of a concrete parking bumper. I pitched forward with no time to catch myself. My knees hit the rough asphalt, tearing the fabric of my scrubs and scraping my skin. My hands slapped against the ground, the impact shooting a sharp ache up my arms. My keys slipped from my fingers and skittered across the dark asphalt, sliding underneath a parked truck nearby. I stayed on the ground. I did not have the energy to stand up. I kneeled there in the empty garage, letting the sting in my palms fade, listening to the lonely sound of my own ragged breathing bouncing off the concrete walls. The garage was silent. I wiped the grit off my hands and leaned forward to look for my keys. Then, the stench rolled over me. There was no build-up, no gradual drift on the air. One breath was clean, and the next was thick enough to gag on. It was the scent of sweet, decaying lilies. It smelled like a small, unventilated room packed with rotting funeral arrangements. The floral rot was so aggressive it overpowered the familiar, harsh odors of exhaust fumes and damp concrete. I pulled the collar of my coat up over my nose, gagging. The smell was thick, coating the back of my throat like syrup. I figured the groundskeeping crew had dumped a huge load of dead landscaping flowers into the industrial trash chute nearby. I got down on my hands and knees, pressing my cheek near the cold ground to peer under the parked truck. The orange light barely reached beneath the chassis. I squinted, looking for the glint of my key ring. From the dark space behind the thick structural pillar 10 feet away, a voice spoke. It called my name. The voice was soft, distressed, and wavering. It echoed strangely off the low ceiling, sounding both very close and very far away at the same time. I tensed up, my hand hovering inches from the tire of the truck. The garage was supposed to be empty. Security guards rarely walked this high up during the night, and they did not know my first name. I stayed on my knees, reasoning with the terror blooming in my chest. I had just taken a hard fall. My skull had rattled when my knees hit the ground. The heavy exhaustion, combined with the sudden shock of the accident, was making my brain misfire. I tried to chalk it up to a documented symptom of severe fatigue. The wind was just whistling through the concrete barriers, and my tired mind was shaping the random noise into a familiar word. I shut my eyes tightly, taking a shallow breath of the rotting flower air. I reached my arm further under the truck. My fingertips brushed the metal ring of my keys. The voice spoke again. It was louder. It did not sound like the wind. It mimicked the exact tone of someone in deep distress, pleading for help. It called my name once more, dragging out the syllables. The illusion of a hallucination vanished. The acoustic reality of the sound was undeniable. It originated from a specific physical point in space behind that concrete pillar. The thick smell of lilies surged, making my eyes water and my stomach turn. I did not stand up to look. I did not call out to ask who was there. I left my keys sitting under the truck. I left my car sitting in its lonely parking space. I pushed myself up from the asphalt and ran. I sprinted toward the downward ramp, my rubber solace slapping loudly against the ground. I bypassed the elevator bank, knowing the metal doors took too long to open and the box was a trap. I ran down the spiraling drive lane, descending rapidly through the levels of the garage. The cold night air whipped against my face. I did not look over my shoulder. I expected a hand to grab the back of my coat at any second. I expected the voice to scream my name from the railing above me. I broke out of the ground floor exit and hit the sidewalk, running out from under the concrete overhang and into the bright streetlights of the city avenue. I waved frantically at a yellow cab idling near the intersection. I threw the back door open, scrambled onto the vinyl seat, and locked the door. I told the driver to go, pointing down the street. The cab pulled away from the curb, merging into the sparse early morning traffic. The heater in the car was blowing warm, dry air. I slumped against the window, watching the hospital buildings blur past. The sheer panic finally dialed back, leaving me shaking. As the adrenaline wore off, my mind cleared just enough to actually process what I had heard. The voice in the dark garage had not just used my given name. It had called out a very specific, obscure childhood nickname. It was a silly, nonsensical word that was only ever spoken by my mother. My mother had vanished without a trace in that exact parking garage 20 years ago. The sub-basement archives smell like decaying paper and secrets. I work as a hospital archivist. My department is responsible for organizing, boxing, and preparing decades of old patient files for digital scanning. The archives are located in the deepest sub-basement of the facility, far below the surgical wards and the bustling lobbies. The space is a sprawling, windowless room with exposed pipes running along the ceiling. It is packed tight with high-density mobile shelving. These are towering metal filing cabinets mounted on tracks in the floor. To open an aisle, you have to turn a large mechanical wheel on the end of the shelf, physically rolling thousands of pounds of paper out of the way. The room is always cool and dry to preserve the documents. The air is thick with the smell of old glue, dust, and brittle manila folders. Because of the concrete walls, cell phone service does not exist down there. You are entirely cut off from the world above. I was working a late shift on a Thursday, pulling records from the late 80s. The isolation usually bothered new hires, but I liked the quiet. It was just me and the files. I turned the mechanical wheel on shelf row 14. The metal gears whined, and the heavy unit rolled slowly to the left, opening a narrow 3-foot wide aisle. The only illumination came from a single bare bulb hanging from a wire in the ceiling, swaying slightly from the vibration of the moving shelves. I walked into the narrow aisle, holding my clipboard, looking for a specific series of patient numbers. The dread crept in slowly. It started with a sound. From the other side of the towering metal shelves, one row over, I heard footsteps. It was not the sharp click of a shoe or the squeak of a rubber sole. It was the wet, flat noise of bare flesh hitting the sealed concrete floor. Slap, slap. The unseen person was pacing just beyond a thin metal barrier of the cabinet. The acoustics in the archives are strange. The tight aisles funnel sound directly into your ears. The pacing was slow, deliberate, and rhythmic. I stopped looking at the files. I held my breath, listening. The archives were closed to general staff after 6 in the evening. Nobody else had swipe access to this room tonight. The wet, barefoot slapping continued, back and forth. 10 steps one way, 10 steps the other. A cold prickle of paranoia erupted across my arms. The rational part of my brain demanded I take control of the situation. I decided the best course of action was to treat this as a normal, albeit annoying, interruption. If I spoke, I could force whatever this was into the realm of the mundane. It was probably just a confused patient who had wandered down the wrong stairwell. Hello? I called out loudly, my voice bouncing off the metal shelves. The archives are closed. You need to go back upstairs to the main lobby. The wet slapping noise stopped. Total silence fell over the room. The person on the other side of the shelf did not answer. They did not shuffle their feet. They just stood frozen in place. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling above my aisle continued to sway back and forth, casting shifting shadows across the floor. I looked toward the end of my narrow aisle, where it met the main walkway. Projected against the far concrete wall of the main walkway was a shadow. The light from my aisle was casting the silhouette of whoever was standing in the next row out onto the wall. I stared at the dark shape, trying to make sense of it. The threat was invisible to me directly, hidden by the metal cabinet, but the shadow told a terrifying story. The silhouette was elongated. The proportions were wrong. The arms hung far too low, ending in long, jagged points instead of hands. The neck was thin and stretched. I took a slow, shaky breath. I hugged my clipboard so tightly against my chest that the cardboard backing dug into my palms. I tried to talk again, my voice shaking this time. Security is on their way down, I lied, hoping to scare the intruder off. The elongated shadow on the wall reacted. Its torso and limbs remained completely rigid. The dark silhouette of the head simply rotated on that thin neck, turning slowly until the profile shifted. The shadow was now facing the entrance to my aisle. It was looking right at the spot where I would have to exit. Terror gripped me, making it hard to draw a breath. I dropped the clipboard. The plastic shattered against the concrete. I did not wait to see if the shadow would move toward me. I backed out of the aisle, keeping my eyes fixed on the open walkway. The moment I cleared the metal shelves, I turned and sprinted toward the exit. I ran past the rows of high-density cabinets, my pulse thudding heavily in my ears. I hit the heavy steel door leading to the stairwell, shoved the crash bar, and practically fell onto the concrete steps. I scrambled up the stairs on my hands and feet, desperate to put distance between myself and the sub-basement. I reached the ground floor, pulled the door shut behind me, and twisted the deadbolt lock until it clicked into place. I did not stop until I reached the back exit of the hospital. I pushed through the double doors and stumbled out into the designated smoking area. The night air was crisp and freezing. I stood alone under the glow of a street lamp, wrapping my arms around myself, gasping for breath. Getting past that heavy steel door and out into the freezing night air was the only thing keeping me from a total breakdown. I leaned against the brick wall of the building, letting my racing pulse slow down. I reached into my pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out a cigarette and a lighter. I struck the flint, the small flame illuminating my hands in the dark. I brought the flame up, keeping my eyes cast downward. The orange light reflected off the surface of my wristwatch. I stopped. I stared at my left wrist. I had not bumped into the shelves. I had not tripped on the stairs. Carved deeply into the tough glass face of my watch, ruining the surface, were 3 long, jagged gray scratches. Working in the hospital morgue means dealing with the things no one else wants to touch. After a long shift of processing, cleaning, and preparing, you are left with mountains of soiled linens. The autopsy tables use thick, specialized cotton sheets that soak up water, chemical preservatives, and organic fluids. These sheets cannot go through the standard hospital laundry chutes. Protocol dictates that the night attendant must manually transport them to the industrial basement laundry facility. The basement laundry is a huge hollow room located directly beneath the oldest wing of the hospital. When you push the heavy double doors open, the overwhelming scale of the room swallows you. The ceiling is crisscrossed with thick, insulated steam pipes. The floor is cracked, unpainted concrete sloping down toward large brass drain grates. Arrayed across the center of the room are the industrial washing machines. These are not standard appliances. They are giant horizontal steel cylinders bolted directly into the foundation, capable of washing 200 pounds of wet fabric at once. It was a quiet Tuesday night. I was alone, dragging a rolling canvas bin full of morgue sheets across the uneven floor. The wheels squealed against the concrete. The air in the room was dense, carrying the permanent, lingering odor of industrial bleach mixed with the faint metallic scent of the morgue. I parked the bin in front of machine number 4. I opened the heavy circular steel door of the washer and began pulling the damp, heavy sheets from the canvas bin, throwing them into the drum. The work was exhausting. My back ached, and my hands were raw from wearing latex gloves for hours. Once the drum was packed, I slammed the door shut, turned the locking wheel until the metal latch caught, and pressed the green start button on the control panel. The machine rumbled to life. The sound of hundreds of gallons of water rushing into the steel drum echoed off the bare concrete walls. I pulled a plastic folding chair from the corner, sat down near the vibrating machine, and stared at the floor, waiting for the cycle to finish. The change in the room happened without any warning. A sudden, aggressive charge of static electricity flooded the air. It was not a subtle feeling. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood up so violently that the follicles ached. My uniform shirt clung to my skin, crackling with dry energy. The air grew thin and tasted like a mouthful of dry tinfoil. I rubbed my arms, confused, looking around the empty room. There were no exposed wires, no strange lights. Just the massive steel washers sitting in the dim gloom. The washing machine cycle reached its end. The internal drum spun down, the water drained, and a loud mechanical click echoed through the room. The locking wheel spun backward on its own. The heavy steel door swung ajar, releasing a puff of damp, chemical-scented steam. I stood up from the plastic chair, reaching for the canvas bin to unload the clean sheets. Before my fingers could touch the fabric cart, the steel door of the washing machine violently slammed shut. The locking wheel spun forward, latching the door tight. The green start button depressed itself. The machine rumbled to life again. Hundreds of gallons of water rushed into the drum, and the cycle started from the very beginning. I stepped back, my heart beating a little faster. I stared at the control panel. These machines were analog, governed by physical dials and heavy relays. They did not have smart computers inside them. They did not restart unless a person physically turned the locking wheel and pushed the button. I tried to convince myself it was just a major electrical short. The ancient wiring in the hospital basement was notorious for failing. A power surge must have arced across the control board, fusing a relay and forcing the machine to loop. It was a mechanical failure, nothing more. I looked up at the digital clock mounted on the concrete wall above the machines. The red LED numbers read 3:45 a.m. The washing machine finished its second cycle in a matter of seconds, far too fast for a standard wash. The water drained rapidly. The latch clicked. The door swung open. Then it slammed shut again. The wheel locked. The water rushed in. I looked back at the clock on the wall. The red LED numbers shifted. They did not move forward. The display flashed, jumping backward to read 3:15 a.m. The static electricity in the air intensified until my skin felt like it was covered in a crawling layer of dry insects. The machine finished its third cycle. The door opened. The door slammed. The water rushed. I looked at the clock. It read 2:45 a.m. Panic began to uncoil in my stomach. I backed away from the machine, retreating toward the canvas bin. The room around me felt wrong. The solid concrete floor began to vibrate, but the vibration felt inverted, pulling at my shoes instead of pushing against them. The fourth cycle ended. The door opened. The door slammed. The clock jumped to 2:15 a.m. I ducked behind the tall canvas laundry cart. I crouched on the floor, pressing my back against the rough fabric of the bin. The claustrophobia of the enormous room pressed down on me. I buried my face in my knees, holding my hands over my ears to block out the rushing sound of the water. I told myself to stay grounded, to cling to logic. It was just a localized magnetic field disturbance messing with the digital clock and the machine relays. I was safe as long as I stayed away from the electrical panel. I opened my eyes and looked at the concrete wall near the entrance. The visual reality of the room began to warp. A thin trickle of dirty water that had pooled near a drain grate was now moving backward, flowing up the slope of the floor and vanishing back into a leaky pipe joint. Dust motes floating in the dim light were drifting in reverse patterns, swirling downward toward the floor before shooting back up toward the ceiling. The fifth cycle ended. The door slammed. I huddled behind the cart, paralyzed. I did not want to stand up. I did not want to run toward the double doors, terrified of what would happen if I tried to move through the warped space in the middle of the room. I held my breath, waiting, hiding like a child from a storm. The double doors leading to the hallway burst open. A hospital night guard rushed into the laundry room. He wore the standard gray uniform, a heavy flashlight gripped in one hand. He scanned the room, his eyes wide and frantic, looking at the vibrating machines. He spotted me crouched behind the canvas bin. He ran across the sloping concrete floor. He did not seem affected by the static charge or the warping space. He reached the cart, holstered his flashlight, and extended his right hand down toward me. "You need to get out of here," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "The main breaker is failing. The whole sublevel is being evacuated." I nearly collapsed with relief. Seeing another person, especially someone with a completely logical explanation, instantly snapped me out of my panic. I reached up and grabbed his outstretched hand. His grip was strong and firm. He pulled me up from the floor, hauling me to my feet. As I stood up, adjusting my balance, my eyes fell on the pager clipped to the guard's belt. Its screen glowed with a bright backlit LCD display. The numbers on the screen were not showing a callback number. The display was counting backward. It dropped from 0 into negative numbers, the digits spinning in a blur of minus signs and chaotic, nonsensical calculations, moving faster and faster the longer he held my hand. Back in 2015, I worked the bulletproof triage booth alone. The emergency room layout at Mercy General was designed to protect the staff from the chaotic, unpredictable elements of the city at night. When patients walked through the sliding glass exterior doors, they entered a small square waiting room filled with hard plastic chairs. To check in, they had to approach a thick floor-to-ceiling barrier of reinforced acrylic glass. I sat on the other side of that glass. My workspace was a tiny, claustrophobic enclosure, no more than 5 feet wide and 6 feet deep. It contained a desk, a computer monitor, a telephone, and a rolling chair. The space felt like a fish tank. There was a narrow metal tray built into the counter, designed to slide back and forth beneath the glass to exchange insurance cards and clipboards. A grid of small circular holes was drilled into the acrylic pane at head height to allow voices to pass through. It was a brutal, isolating assignment. You spent 12 hours locked in a small box, watching exhausted, sick, and sometimes dangerous people pace the waiting room. Thursday morning at 4 a.m. is usually the most dead part of the shift. The waiting room was completely empty. The harsh overhead fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, annoying hum. I was sitting at my desk, typing up patient logs from earlier in the shift, trying to keep my eyes open. A sharp, unnatural draft swept across my face. I stopped typing. The temperature inside the tight booth plummeted. The air grew brittle and biting, carrying a chill that cut right through my uniform sweater. I traced the source of the cold. A concentrated, freezing stream of air was seeping directly through the speaker holes drilled into the acrylic glass. I rubbed my stiff fingers together. The hospital habit systems were always temperamental, but this draft felt focused, like someone had opened a commercial freezer door directly on the other side of the glass. The sliding exterior doors of the waiting room parted. A person walked into the bright lobby. They wore a heavy, dark winter coat, the collar pulled up high around their neck, and a dark knit cap pulled down low over their forehead. Their face was entirely obscured by the fabric and the shadow. They walked slowly across the waiting room floor, their boots making no sound against the linoleum. They stopped directly in front of my booth, standing on the other side of the acrylic glass, facing the speaker holes. I shivered, crossing my arms over my chest, rubbing my shoulders to generate some heat. Did someone leave the front doors propped open? I asked, attempting a polite customer service smile. It feels like January in here. The patient did not answer. They stood completely frozen. The freezing draft pouring through the holes grew stronger, carrying a faint scent of dry earth and frozen leaves. I waited for them to speak, to declare a symptom or ask for a form. The silence stretched. I tilted my head slightly to the left, trying to look past the high collar of their coat to catch a glimpse of their eyes. The patient tilted their head to the left, matching the exact angle of my movement. I stopped. I straightened my neck. The patient straightened their neck. A spike of unease drove into my stomach. Working triage, you deal with people in altered mental states all the time. You see drug reactions, severe concussions, and psychiatric episodes. You learn to handle bizarre behavior. But this felt different. It felt calculated. I brought my right hand up to rest on my chin, leaning my elbow on the desk. The patient brought their right arm up, resting a gloved hand against the collar of their coat, mimicking my posture. My heart rate jumped. I dropped my hand back to the keyboard. I decided the best way to handle the situation was to retreat behind the impenetrable wall of hospital routine. If I performed my job, if I followed the script, I could maintain a psychological barrier against whatever game this person was playing. I need your ID and your insurance card to check you into the system, I said, keeping my voice flat and professional. I refused to look at the dark space under their knit cap. I focused my eyes on the computer monitor, staring at the blank intake form. I reached out and grabbed the handle of the metal sliding tray. I pushed it forward, sliding it through the gap under the glass into the waiting room. Out of the corner of my peripheral vision, I saw the patient mirror my arm extension. They reached into their deep coat pocket, pulled something out, and placed it into the metal tray. I pulled the tray back to my side of the glass. I did not examine the object closely. I just saw a rectangular shape, roughly the size of a standard driver's license. I picked it up with 2 fingers, slipped it into my uniform pocket, and kept my eyes glued to the glowing screen. "Can you confirm your date of birth for the record?" I asked the screen. The patient said nothing. They just stood there, their posture a perfect, unsettling mirror of my own tense, rigid stance in the chair. For the next 2 hours, I sat in the freezing booth, entering random keystrokes into the computer system to look busy. I did not ask any more questions. I did not look at the glass. I endured the biting cold and the suffocating presence on the other side of the acrylic barrier. I fixated on the digital display, mentally dragging the minutes forward toward my relief. At 6:15 a.m., the heavy metal door at the back of the booth unlocked. The day shift nurse stepped in, carrying a travel mug of coffee. "Morning," she said, her voice bright and normal. "Quiet night?" I flinched, spinning around in my chair. I looked at the glass. The waiting room was empty. The patient was gone. The freezing draft vanished, replaced by the normal, warm air of the hospital corridor leaking in from the open back door. The relief was a physical weight lifting off my shoulders. I stood up on shaky legs, grabbed my bag, and told the nurse I had left a blank intake form open on the computer. I did not mention the patient. I just wanted to leave. I walked out of the hospital, got into my car, and drove home in silence. The heater in my car blasted warm air against my face, melting away the lingering chill of the booth. By the time I unlocked the front door of my apartment, the terror had faded into pure exhaustion. I convinced myself it was just a weird run-in with a disturbed patient, and finally felt secure in my own space. I went into the living room, changed out of my stiff uniform, and put on soft flannel pajamas. I walked into the kitchen, boiled water, and made a cup of hot chamomile tea. I carried the mug to the couch, sat down, and let the warmth soak into my hands. The morning sun was shining through the window blinds, casting bright, safe lines of light across the rug. I reached over to the coffee table where I had dumped the contents of my pockets. Sitting on top of my keys was the rectangular card the patient had placed in the metal tray. I picked it up. It was not a plastic insurance card. It was a thin, rectangular strip of dried, leathery human skin, burned deeply into the center of the rough tissue, rendered in neat, precise numbers. Was my own hospital employee identification code. Blood tastes like bright copper, especially when there is no wound. I work as the night shift director for the entire hospital network. My job is administrative oversight. While the doctors and nurses handle the patients, I handle the facility. I make sure the security patrols hit their marks, the maintenance crews stay on schedule, and the various departments communicate. Because I manage the overarching structure, I spend a lot of time walking the public areas after hours. The grand lobby of the main building is an expansive architectural showpiece. It was designed to impress wealthy donors. The floor is laid with polished white marble. The ceiling arches 3 stories overhead, supported by thick pillars. One entire side of the lobby consists of towering glass panels facing the front circular driveway and the fountain. At 4 in the morning, the space is entirely deserted. The information desks are empty. The gift shop is locked behind a metal grate. Walking across the marble floor feels like crossing a frozen lake. The immense, echoing layout makes you feel small and exposed. I was doing my final walk through the night. I had my clipboard tucked under my arm, checking the cleaning logs posted near the main entrance. That was when a distinct, awful flavor coated my tongue out of nowhere. It was sharp and distinct. The flavor of raw copper flooded my mouth, harsh and metallic. I ran my tongue along my teeth and the inside of my cheeks, expecting to find a cut or a loose crown. There was no pain. There was no source. The taste just sat there, thick and overwhelming, making my saliva feel slick and raw. I swallowed hard, grimacing. Then the overhead public address system engaged. The speakers mounted in the high ceiling activated. It was not a general page. The voice that echoed through the massive lobby was calm, clear, and perfectly detached. It was my voice. "The night director is now standing near the north entrance," the voice announced. He is rubbing his jaw with his right hand. I stood dead still, my hand pressed firmly against my cheek. I lowered my arm slowly. The voice reverberating off the marble walls was an exact audio duplicate of my own tone, my own cadence, stripped of any emotion. My immediate reaction was anger. The public address system was controlled from the main security office, located down a short corridor just off the lobby. I suspected the new night guard was playing a prank. He must have recorded my voice during an earlier briefing and was now broadcasting it over the system to mess with me. It was a severe breach of professional protocol. My mind immediately locked onto the employee handbook. I was going to walk into that office, demand his badge, and fire him on the spot. I turned away from the entrance and began to march across the vast marble floor toward the security corridor. "The director is walking toward the east corridor," my voice broadcasted from above. His pace is rigid. He is looking straight ahead. The narration was real time. The guard was watching me on the closed-circuit cameras. I picked up my pace, my hard-soled shoes echoing sharply against the stone. The director is speeding up. He is angry. The taste of copper in his mouth is making him swallow frequently. I stopped dead in my tracks. The anger vanished, replaced by an icy, paralyzing fear. The security cameras did not have audio. They were cheap, grainy video feeds. No one sitting in a room down the hall could know about the metallic taste in my mouth. No one could know I was swallowing to clear the phantom blood from my tongue. I stood in the exact center of the vast lobby. The glass walls reflected the dim ambient lights, turning the windows into giant, dark mirrors. I realized I was being watched by something that was not using a camera. The director is standing still. The voice echoed from the ceiling. He is afraid to look at the glass. My breath hitched. The voice was right. I kept my eyes fixed on the distant security office door. I refused to turn my head toward the huge windows lining the room. I felt an intense, crushing sense of voyeurism. The open space of the lobby offered zero cover. Whatever was broadcasting my movements was tracking every subtle shift of my posture, every nervous twitch of my fingers. I forced myself to walk again. I needed to reach the security office. I needed to find another human being. He is moving again. He is trying to act brave. He is clenching his left fist. I unclenched my fist. He just opened his left hand. The narration was flawless. I tried to stutter my steps, pausing for a fraction of a second and then surging forward, trying to trick the voice, trying to make it predict a movement that I would then alter. The voice did not predict. It just narrated perfectly, adjusting its rhythm to match my erratic steps without a single delay. It was holding a mirror up to my physical existence in real time. I neared the edge of the marble floor. The entrance to the security office was right in front of me. The office featured a set of heavy double doors with dark tinted glass panels set into the wood. The taste of copper in my mouth grew so strong it burned the back of my throat. I reached out toward the metal handle of the right door. The director is reaching for the handle. My voice echoed across the empty lobby. He's going to look at the glass. I did not want to look. I tried to focus my eyes only on the metal handle. I commanded the muscles in my neck to stay rigid. But the human instinct to check a dark reflection is too strong to fight when you are terrified. As my fingers curled around the cold metal, my eyes flicked upward to the tinted glass pane. I saw my reflection. I saw my suit, my pale face, my terrified expression. I was staring wide-eyed at the glass. In the reflection, my face blinked. The eyelids in the glass closed and opened in a slow, deliberate motion. My actual eyes had not blinked. The voice on the intercom spoke one last time. The director realizes the mistake. A cold, wet hand gripped the back of my neck. At 5 a.m., while the ICU below finally slept, I crawled into the ductwork to fix a failed vent baffle. I work as a maintenance technician for the hospital heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. The building is old, a patchwork of renovations and add-ons that have created a maze of aluminum ductwork hidden above the ceiling tiles. Most of the runs are narrow, twisting passages designed to push filtered air into the sterile environments of the intensive care units. When a motorized baffle fails in the middle of the night, someone has to crawl into the dark and replace it manually. It was near the end of my shift. The hospital was in that quiet lull right before the morning staff arrived. I opened the metal access panel in the ceiling of a vacant supply closet, climbed my ladder, and hoisted myself into the main supply duct for the 4th floor. The duct was square, bare aluminum, measuring roughly 3 feet wide and 2 feet high. There was barely enough room to drag myself forward on my stomach. The air inside was dry and carried the faint smell of old dust. I wore a hard hat equipped with a headlamp, which cast a narrow beam of white light ahead of me. The rest of the space was pitch black. I crawled for 20 minutes, navigating the tight corners, my heavy canvas work pants scraping against the metal bottom. The sense of balance in my head started to warp. As I pulled myself forward using my elbows, my sense of balance twisted sideways without warning. The duct was laid perfectly flat across the ceiling supports. I knew this for a fact. My inner ears started failing me. The flat metal bottom of the duct suddenly felt like it was pitching down to the left. I paused, pressing my gloved hands flat against the metal beneath me. I waited for the sensation to pass. I deal with tight spaces every night. The brain relies on visual cues to determine balance, and in a pitch-black box with only a single beam of light, spatial disorientation is a known hazard. I fell back on statistics. I'd heard stories of guys getting dizzy in the dark, a simple case of sensory deprivation that the veterans always joked about. I took a breath and continued crawling. The feeling worsened with every foot I traveled. The tilt grew steeper. The wall to my left no longer felt like a wall. It felt like the floor. Gravity seemed to be pulling me sideways. I found myself leaning hard to the right just to keep my torso centered, pressing my shoulder against the opposite wall to brace myself from falling into the side of the duct. My stomach rolled with nausea. The conflicting sensory input was making me dizzy. The metal beneath my stomach felt solid, but my brain screamed that I was sliding down a steep incline. I stopped moving. I closed my eyes, trying to shut off the visual feed to let my inner ear reset. "It is just a flat piece of aluminum," I whispered to myself, my voice sounding muffled in the tight space. "You are crawling on a flat plane. The exit grade is 30 feet ahead. Just push forward." I opened my eyes. The beam of my headlamp cut through the dark shaft. I tried to force my brain to settle. If I could just make it to the next junction, the duct widened and I could turn around. I forced my elbows to move. I dragged my boots. Every inch felt like a massive physical struggle against an invisible force trying to pull me sideways into the dark. I raised my head to check the distance to the junction. 50 feet ahead, hovering in the absolute blackness of the duct, two pale spheres caught the light of my headlamp. They were smooth, dull white, and perfectly round. They were spaced a few inches apart, hanging right in the middle of the narrow passage. I stopped breathing. The headlamp beam illuminated the spheres clearly. They did not reflect light like animal eyes. They absorbed the glow, looking like two pieces of polished bone. There was no face attached to them. There was no body blocking the passage. Just the two pale objects hanging in the void. I stared at them. The sickening pull of sideways gravity intensified, making the world spin. The two spheres did not blink. They did not drift. They were fixed on me. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it was just a pair of discarded screws catching the light, or a trick of the dust motes in the narrow beam. Then, the spheres slowly shifted. They rotated downward, as if whatever was holding them had just tilted its head to get a better look at me. I lost my grip on logic. Panic tore through my chest. I began to kick backward. The duct was too narrow to turn around in. I had to push myself in reverse, using my boots to shove my body away from the staring white objects. My elbows slammed against the aluminum walls. The metal groaned under my frantic movements. I did not care how much noise I made. I just wanted out. I scraped my knees and tore my shirt, shoving myself backward through the maze. The journey that took 20 minutes forward felt like it took hours in reverse. The sideways gravity made me stumble and roll, smashing my hard hat against the low ceiling. My boots finally hit open air. I felt the edge of the access panel. I felt the edge of the access panel. I scrambled backward, falling out of the ceiling and tumbling down the rungs of the ladder. I crashed onto the floor of the supply closet, landing hard on my back. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed the door handle, and threw myself out into the hallway. The hospital corridor was bright and empty. The morning shift had just arrived. I could hear voices down by the nursing station. The feeling of sideways gravity vanished the second I left the closet. I leaned against the wall, gasping, my chest heaving. My clothes were covered in silver dust. I did not stop to explain anything to the nurses. I kept walking, my pace turning into a jog, until I reached the front lobby and pushed through the revolving glass doors. I stumbled out into the employee parking lot. The morning sun was rising over the city skyline, casting bright, blinding light across the asphalt. The air was cool and fresh. I stood near my truck, resting my hands on my knees while the morning sun beat down on me. I finally felt grounded again. I stood up straight and brushed the dust off my canvas pants. I looked down at the bright asphalt to check my boots. The sun was directly behind me, shining fiercely against my back. I stared at the ground in front of my feet. The pavement was bare. Despite the blinding morning light hitting my body, I was casting no shadow. Fear rarely lives in the extraordinary. It hides in the routines we trust, waiting for a single misstep to shatter the illusion of safety. Keep pulling at those threads by diving into 11 true horror stories told by gas station clerks right here on screen, where the night shift holds secrets that never see the sun.